Good evening. This video is a review of an important book, The Education of an Idealist by Samantha Power. Why important? Because of four reasons. One, the author. Samantha Power was the United States ambassador to the United Nations for quite an important period during the Barack Obama administration. Before that, she was a scholar at Harvard. Before that, and here's the interesting part, she was a reporter on the ground in the Balkans covering the Yugoslavia war. And on the back of that experience in the 1990s in the Balkans, she wrote a very important book that became very successful called A Problem from Hell. And in that book, she not only documented what she had seen in the Balkans, but in addition to that, she theorized on one very important point, and that is what kind of humanitarian crisis merits the intervention of the global community, especially the major powers, especially the United States, so that to end that humanitarian crisis. And not only that, she also put forward the how. How can the major powers intervene? Politically, economically, diplomatically, and militarily. After she finished all of that and she returned to the US, wrote her book, did a degree at Harvard in law, she became a very important authority almost, not only on the Balkans, but specifically on that dimension of humanitarian crises in foreign policy and what kind of responses from international powers, especially the United States. A number of people reached out to listen to her. One of them was a congressman by the name of Barack Obama. When he ran for president, she joined his campaign as an advisor. When he became president, he appointed her as the US's ambassador to the United Nations. But the importance of Samantha Power does not come from her being at that position, but rather at the richness of her experience. The second reason why The Education of an Idealist is an important book is the topic, the education. Of course, the idealist here is Samantha Power. What kind of education does the book refer to? It is primarily the decision-making process of the United States during the time of the Obama administration with regard to the Syria war. Not because the Syria war particularly was very important for the Obama administration, no. Rather, because in the thinking of Samantha Power, the Syria war, or the different facets of the Syria war, or some episodes in specific in the Syria war, qualify as a humanitarian crisis that merits the intervention of the international community and specifically of the United States. So very much what she has written about before, the problem from hell. And the subject of the book, the education, is the decision-making process within the Obama administration. On one hand, you have Samantha Power arguing for a US intervention in Syria to put an end to what she saw as a humanitarian crisis. And on the other hand, many other voices inside the administration that see or saw the Syria crisis primarily from a realpolitik point of view. Do the interests of the United States in that dossier, in that issue, merit an intervention of a certain sort, militarily in this case, or not? So in reality, the main core issue of that book is not just about realpolitik versus humanitarian driver for intervention. No, it is whether in the absence of realpolitik or realpolitik interests, do or does the humanitarian crisis on its own merit the US or a major power to intervene, to end that humanitarian situation. Again, even if it does not have interests there, or if its interests there are not to intervene. This is the main dilemma in the book. And I think it's a very, very important discussion, actually. And even if somebody says, oh, come on, it's actually very obvious, it is that way or that way, the point is which side you take or you think makes absolute sense, or you think history has taught us is the answer. The main issue here is the nature of the discussion itself, specifically in the dynamics of the foreign policy of a major power, supreme power, superpower, the United States. The third reason why the book is important is that Samantha Power was in the room where the decision was being made, where the discussions took place. Obviously, in the room here is an analogy. In the room, many, many times when the debate was raging, the two sides of the argument were being put forward. Now, we have seen many books, of course, from members of different American administrations who were in the room, participated in the National Security Council meetings and what have you, whereby we got the inside view. Yes, but what sets the education of an idealist apart is that from the very beginning we know that the argument that Samantha Power stood for failed. The US did not intervene in Syria the way Samantha Power wanted. Barack Obama was not convinced by the arguments that Samantha Power put forward. And some readers might find actually the interaction, which Samantha Power recounts in the book, between her and Barack Obama quite interesting, or maybe even revealing about some aspects of his own thinking. Perhaps, and that's maybe of importance to many readers. But for me, the real point here is not the thinking, potentially the thinking process of Barack Obama. No. Rather, it is being inside the room, getting an internal view of the debates that were there to make the decision of the United States between these two different views, but we hear it not only from someone who was in the room or who was privy to the discussions, but rather someone whose argument she confesses lost. This is not very common at all in that type of books. The fourth reason why the education of an idealist is important is a matter of perception, if you'd like. Samantha Power belongs to effectively the liberal elite of the United States, especially in the Northeast. The one that you find in major think tanks, in the Ivy League universities of America, in some sections of the Democratic Party. In a way, influential circles who, even though they do acknowledge that often, very often, in the past 50, 60, 70 years, the US's interventions in different parts of the world were primarily driven or stemming from its pursuit of its own interests, preserving the interests, securing them, advancing its own interests, even though they acknowledge that still that liberal elite of the US very much sees some sort of a mission of the US in the world. They connect its positioning, its foreign policy to the ideals that the founding fathers of the US had spoken about almost 250 years ago. There's this idea of the role of America in the world that is always there within that section of theorists and practitioners of American foreign policy, even if and even when they do acknowledge that very often it was not the case. But at the core of their thinking, there is this connection between, again, the role of the US, its positioning, its mission, with its ideals. This this conception of a city on a hill that has a grand role in the march of humanity. All of that on one side, versus on the other, what many readers the world over will see as, will not even recognize, because for many, many readers all over the world, the presence of the US in these different parts of the world, the foreign policy of the US has always been, in that line of thinking, driven, of course, by its interests, whether strategic interests or interests in that part of the world, whatever that part is, without much regard to any other factor. Again, the point here is not whether you agree with the liberal elites in America's view about the role of the US in the world, or whether you agree with the view that is quite predominant or prominent amongst many people in the world when they observe US foreign policy. This is not the issue. The issue is the gulf in perception. That is very important for any observer of foreign policy, observer of American foreign policy, specifically at a time when there is a new rival to the US emerging, which is China, and which is effecting a change, very much potentially a strategic change in American foreign policy. Now, that perception gap, or at least to see as an international reader how the liberal elite in the US has that view of American foreign policy, is very important to understand one of the most important drivers, thinking flow, if you'd like, in American foreign policy. To summarize, this is a beautiful book, very well written. It's coming from the heart, clearly. Samantha Power is frank in how she puts her views, her failure, if you like. It's a very courageous book, actually. But in addition to that, it is an important book for anyone interested in international affairs, and particularly in American foreign policy, for the 4 reasons I tried to elaborate